But welcome everybody. If you don't know me, I'm Catherine Pemberton. I'm the director of the Powder Magazine, of course, which is owned and operated by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the state of South Carolina. We hope you come and visit the Powder Magazine. It is kind of the living embodiment of Carolina the first 50 years. It's the if you've not been here, it's really the last standing remnant of the fortification system. It's one of the earliest buildings we have built by the proprietary government. If you have been coming to our lectures, we have had some really great ones this series. John Hyatt talked about the early kind of governmental formation of Carolina. We had John Marcoux talking about the indigenous landscape of the early colonial period. And then last week we had Nicole Eisenberger, who's the archaeologist out at Charlestown Landing, really kind of run us through some of the recent findings out there. And if you missed any of those, I've got all of those up on our YouTube channel and happy to share with you. But today, I think we're really going to kind of wrap up this whole series with Dr. John Navin, who has written this really extraordinary book that you see on the screen, The Grim Years, and it's really about settling South Carolina in that first 50-year period, that first half century. And it is a grim story, not necessarily a casual beach read. It really, we were talking earlier, it really does go into, the early period, and it is I think it's been an unexplored story, an unexplored topic, and we'll get into some of that. But things were not always rosy in that first 50-year period, but it really sets the stage for everything to come. And then, unless we really kind of understand that foundational period with this and the walled city, then we really can't understand the rest. So I'm excited that everybody's here. If you are a tour guide, put your name in the chat and we'll get you those continuing education credits, and I'll go through that at the end. But I want to introduce our speaker. I read this book pretty soon after it came out during COVID through USC Press. It came out in 2020, and I was just blown away by it. It really kind of starts with the Barbados story, and John will get into that, but it's really fantastic, and he's got some amazing footnotes in here for all of his sources, which I love to be able to track all that stuff down. But Dr. Navin is from Boston. He's a New Englander. He went to Boston College, got his PhD at Brandeis University. He teaches at the Coastal Carolina University and has since 1999. He specializes in early American history, is on the history faculty, and we were just talking about the fact that he is a general historian. So we were talking about kind of being a generalist as opposed to being a specific nitty-gritty Charleston expert. But he has a great context, a great sense of the context in this early period. He's published a lot of articles about colonial America in general, and he's got 2 book projects on the way. And so I think I'll turn it over to John Navin, and we'll catch up at the end for questions. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I don't know how many associates you might have at the Powder Magazine, but thank you to the whole enterprise. As Catherine pointed out, I am a generalist. I do teach courses specializing in early American history, but I can range anywhere from Reformation Europe all the way up to the end of the Civil War. And I also teach the Vietnam War class here. So I tend to take a larger view. And one of the things that I hoped to bring today was an even larger scope than my book presents. I promised Catherine I'd have a few new things to say. because I think people tend to look very closely um, at a topic and not always appreciate the context that it's happening in. So let me just move ahead because I've got a lot to cover. I imagined the tale of early Carolina as being a story that if you watch a movie or a TV series and detectives are trying to solve a crime, they're always putting pins on boards and pictures and connecting them. You'll see strings and things. And so this is my attempt to reconstruct Carolina's past, not by starting out in Carolina, but looking at looking elsewhere. And I'll explain why. I'm going to put my first pin in Portugal. Now, this might seem an odd place to start talking about Carolina. This fellow you see here is Henry the Navigator. Portugal, as you know, is on the Atlantic side of the Iberian Peninsula. And Portugal was one of the territories overrun in the year 700 when Muslim forces, or the Moors as they called them, swept in coming from northern Africa and occupied the entire Iberian Peninsula, pushing up into southern France and over towards eastern parts of Europe. And so then until 1492, there would be an effort by Christians to push back. And so for hundreds of years, you had Christians and Muslims and Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, sometimes fighting, sometimes living alongside each other. If you really get into this, you'll find out that there was slavery on both sides, Christians taking Muslim slaves, Muslims taking Christian slaves. And the terms of slavery under Muslim law or religion is quite different than what we would see later in Carolina. But that's just background. Before the Muslims were pushed out of the Iberian Peninsula, before Spain was united, Portugal got united and was organized and recognized as an independent country. And King John of Portugal in 1415 took the city of Ceuta in northern Africa, which was a tremendously important trading center and an important fortified city. And he took that with the help of his sons and their forces, especially Henry, his second son. And it's that year, 1415, that Henry the Navigator brings together map makers and sea captains and boat builders, and he tries to advance the art of seamanship. And with that, he initiates exploration along the African coast. Why? Portugal is located at the the wrong end of the Mediterranean if you want to take advantage of the trade, the spice trade, the trade coming in from Asia. Very lucrative trade. That's why we had the Medicis and the rich merchants in Genoa, because what we would refer to as the Italians now were capitalizing on that trade coming through the Mediterranean. If you're sitting out here in the Atlantic, you're not in the position to be over here getting those goods and bringing them to other Europeans. So what Henry wants and what Portugal wants is to get around Africa, to get to Asia directly by sea, by boat. The problem is, if you look at maps back in 1415, they don't know what Africa looks like. They know about Northern Africa because they've been doing business and buying slaves and done some traveling in Northern Africa. They know Africa about to the Sahara, but that's all they know. So they're exploring along the coast of Africa, trying to find a way around it. And in the course of this, they will hug the coast. They will start trading for ivory. They'll start trading or looking for gold, and they will start trading for enslaved Africans. So here we see the beginning of the African slave trade. And this, of course, is going to be very relevant to Carolina later on. They will also circle around to get back to Portugal as they sail down, they have to come back. They'll find what we know as the Portuguese or Portugal current. They will discover the Canary Islands, they'll discover the Azores and Madeira, and eventually Cape Verde Islands as they work their way back. So during Henry's lifetime, Henry the Navigator, Portuguese exploration will get down to about this point. And that will be 1460 when he dies. But that continuation, that exploration will continue. And it's on the island of Madeira that the Portuguese really begin intensive sugar cultivation. So when we are talking about Barbados later on, know that the Portuguese are doing this in 1500 in Madeira, large scale. In the Canary Islands, they basically try and put all of the islanders to work. The Pope comes out with a papal bull prohibiting slavery in the Canary Islands. So the Portuguese are making progress going southward. They're discovering these important islands, and they've begun sugar production. Eventually, on this map, you'll see that the purple is Henry the Navigator, how far he got. The other names that we remember in particular, Bartholomew Diaz, this gold exploration, he gets down. This is a bit misleading. He actually sails further out and catches currents and comes up at the southern tip of Africa from below. He goes into some Arctic kind of regions, and he comes up and he doesn't know where he is. And when he makes the turn and starts heading north east, he realizes he's gone around the tip of Africa. He wants to keep going, but his men refuse. They threaten a mutiny. So he goes back. But this is now 1488. The Portuguese now know their way around Africa. Da Gama will be the one who takes the currents and goes all the way around and ends up over in India. But that's not till 1497. So if you think about those dates, 1488, Diaz comes back with the news, and Da Gama heads out in 1497. What happens in between? Well, my next pin is going to be Spain, because as you all know, between those two dates is 1492. And that's when we start talking about the man who was financed by these two, Ferdinand and Isabella. They had married, and they had united their two kingdoms, Aragon and Castile, into the Kingdom of Spain. And so in 1492, the Reconquista, which had begun with the invasion of the Muslims back in 700, it's finally completed with the surrender of Granada in 1492. That is the same year, of course, that Columbus sails west, financed by Ferdinand and Isabella, and comes rushing back with the news that he has gotten to India. He's gotten to China to Asia by sailing west. This is enormous news. I should mention that Columbus first went to King John of Portugal asking for financing from him. I'm teaching a course right now where one of the big things we discuss is how history turns on individual moments and could go different ways. And just think if King John of Portugal had said yes to Columbus and he sailed west from Portugal, how that would have changed things. That's the discussion for a different day. But Columbus comes rushing back. And now you have a situation where the Spanish are worried that the Portuguese are going to, using that news, they're going to head west as well and pouring in on Spain's discoveries. So Spain goes to the Pope, and the Pope ends up mediating between Portugal and Spain by drawing a line of demarcation. This is the 1493 Inter Cartera, where the Pope separates the world, what has not been discovered or claimed yet by a Christian nation, everything from this line west all the way to where that line connects on the other side of the world. West of that line will belong to Spain. Everything east of that line, all the way to where it connects over in Asia, going the other way, will belong to Portugal. A year later, they renegotiate that. The Portuguese want to renegotiate because they are sailing increasingly westward to get around Africa, and they can't be restricted by this line. So this is the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, that is moved further west. And keep in mind, we can look at this and see that, oh, that gives Portugal a fair chunk of Brazil. Well, they didn't know that at the time. Nobody knew Brazil was there. Nobody knew South America was there. That was Cabral discovered South America in 1500. So now you have the Spanish with free reign going west of that line, and the Portuguese with free reign east of that line. Something I should point out is if you cannot go mucking about in lands east of this line, when the Spanish have killed off so many Native Americans that they need more forced labor, where do they want to get it? They want to get it from Africa, enslaved Africans, but they cannot go to Africa because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. So they have to give the Portuguese, the asiento, a license to bring enslaved Africans to Spanish territory because they can't go to Africa themselves to do that. Later on, the Dutch and then the English will get that slave trading license. So this brings Brazil into the picture. Here's a 1500, no, it's later than that. I'm sorry, early 1500s map that shows Brazil. What you see here is native people and a lot of trees and fallen trees. That's because the industry that the Portuguese go into Brazil for is Brazil wood. Among its uses are it's used to make a very heavy dye, which is kind of ironic because we know the second major crop in Carolina is going to be what? It's going to be indigo, which is a plant used to make a dye for the textile industry. So the Portuguese go in for the Brazil wood, but they end up, because they've got experience growing sugar in Madeira and elsewhere, they start building sugar plantations. In 1534, you start to see flourishing sugar plantations that belong to the Portuguese in Brazil. The Dutch will become involved. They start honing in on Portuguese claims because the other countries in Europe, England and France and the Dutch, don't want to abide by the Pope's line or by the Treaty of Tordesillas. And so the Dutch will start getting invested in the African slave trade, building forts like this. This is a Dutch fort in Ghana. And they will also move in on the Portuguese sugar industry. They capture Pernambuco in 1629. So now Brazil, you have the Dutch in the northern part of Brazil working the sugar industry. They've disrupted the Portuguese sugar industry. The Portuguese, of course, are not going to sit content with this situation. And so they will come back, and in 1654, they will basically drive the Dutch out of Brazil. Among the settlers in the Dutch portion of Brazil will be Sephardic Jews who were evicted or chose to leave Spain in 1492 because Ferdinand and Isabella issued an edict that said either you will convert to Christianity or you will be expelled or worse. So those Jews who weren't ready to convert to Christianity had to find some place to go. Some of them end up in Brazil, and they get very invested in the sugar industry as well as the Dutch. So when the Dutch are pushed out in 1654, not only do they leave, but a lot of these Sephardic Jews leave. And one of the places that some of them will go will be Barbados. Something you should know is the Dutch were the greatest refiner of sugars in Europe. In 1662, Amsterdam alone had 50 to 60 refineries. You might ask, well, why don't they just refine the sugar the same place they grow the sugar cane? When you refine sugar, it becomes fragile as far as travel goes. If you try and ship sugar from Brazil and ship it overseas, it gets ruined. And so you ship sugar cane, or you ship what you extract the juices from it, if you will, and that will be refined in Europe where it can be redistributed. And the Dutch are the leaders in that industry. So if you think of this, the Dutch had gotten a good share of sugar production in Brazil, but then they're pushed out. They still want to refine sugar, but they can't do it they can't grow the sugar themselves. So they want to work with other countries to refine it. And one of the things they will do is they will help the English in Barbados build a sugar industry. Also in Barbados, you have some of those Sephardic Jews who leave Brazil when the Portuguese come and force the Dutch out. So in my book, I talked about the English colonizing Barbados in 1625 and then developing the sugar industry. And we talk about the plantation system and the sugar industry as if the English really were the leaders in it. And what I hope I've shown you now is the Portuguese really took a leading role, and it was in Madeira and then Brazil that the real plantation system, where you're using enslaved laborers to grow one very, very profitable crop for export, that is technology, and that's a strategy that's imported, if you will, to Barbados. So we've been giving the Barbadians and the English too much credit. That's part of my message here. So let's talk about what's happening in Barbados. Barbados originally was established with tobacco as their main crop. And as I mentioned in the book, their tobacco is so bad that it said that tobacco barons in Barbados smoke tobacco from Virginia while they grow tobacco for exports. Their tobacco is inferior. The tobacco industry is not doing well, but in the 1640s, okay, they start experimenting with sugar. And the arrival of the Dutch and the Sephardic Jews really moved that ahead. And so the workforce in Barbados originally are white indentured servants. Those are the ones who are working on the tobacco plantations. Now you start to get increasing numbers of enslaved Africans imported. And remember, the Dutch are participating in this as well. They're now involved in the slave trade. Here's a quote from Henry Whistler. Most Barbados gentry had 100 or 200 or 300 slave apes whom they command as they please. So does this mean it's all gone over in 1655 to enslaved Africans? No. In 1657, Richard Lejeune is talking about the cruelty. I've seen such cruelty done to servants. These are white servants from England, from Ireland, from other places in Europe. I tell in the book one tragic tale about how 200 or so young Frenchmen are tricked by some English shysters who bring them to Barbados and sell them. And those 200 or so Frenchmen are sold, I think it was at about 800 to 900 pounds a piece, and none of them survive. They all die on Barbados. And in Ireland, the term "they're being Barbados" means they're just being kidnapped. So on Barbados, you have servants who have gone there by choice, thinking they would be getting freedom dues at the end of their indenture, and you have kidnapped servants. And you need to know that the average life of an Englishman in Barbados is something like 2 to 3 years. So these servants, most of them never receive their freedom dues because they don't live long enough. And also, the Barbados is not a large island, and the property quickly is taken up by major planters. And so these freemen, when the servants are freed, there's no land for them anyway. So the possibility of a slave rebellion is present. The possibility of a servant rebellion is present. The nightmare scenario is that the servants and slaves should rise up together. And that's why we see the early Barbadian homes, the mansions, built like fortresses. Some have moats, walls, bars. These are built to withstand attack. So life is not good for these sugar barons, but they are getting enormously rich. So I mentioned the plantation system. This is, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. It's an early venture. It's an early capitalist venture in which planters use slave labor to produce one cash crop for export. And that will be the general definition of the plantation system. And as I said, it's not invented on Barbados, but we can say it's perfected to a fine degree in Barbados. Here's a look at Barbados' population. You can see in 1642, 37,000 or so whites, 6,000 Africans. 1655, it's close. In 1660, I say in the book, the balance of enslaved Africans and whites on the island is 50-50 in 1660. And then look, it continues. By 1684, it's going to be 20,000 whites to 46,000 enslaved Africans. So this is a situation where the whites on the island are increasingly concerned about a slave uprising and a servant uprising, yet they continue to import enslaved Africans because they're crucial to their workforce. One estimate by a Barbadian planter is that if he doesn't import more enslaved Africans every year, within 10 years, his entire workforce will be gone. And so this constant influx of enslaved Africans, they want more servants as well, but around 1660, the supply of servants is drying up in England. They actually will pass laws prohibiting the export or trying to keep more and more people around, because the overpopulation in England is not a severe problem anymore, and they're losing a lot of their workers. So the servant population is going to decline. And as these two groups mix, white servants and enslaved Africans, the whites become increasingly resentful. They don't want to work alongside slaves. You might say they don't want to be treated by slaves, but we know, as I point out in the book, that the white servants, in many cases, by different accounts, are treated worse than the enslaved Africans. Now, how can that be? That white planters are treating the white slaves worse than the enslaved Africans? It's because they've got more of an investment in the Africans. A white servant, the cost of importing a white servant, he will earn that back in 2 years. So after that, it's all profit. And if he dies in 5 years, if he dies in 7 years, you've made your money. You're not going to be out a lot. And an enslaved African is yours for life. So if you could keep an enslaved African working for 10, 15, 20 years, that's in your best interest economically. So the servants complain that they are treated worse than hogs and worse than the slaves around them. But you can see the population trend here, and certainly looking ahead to Carolina, you should see the handwritings on the wall. And just note the fact that these people know that they are creating a situation, they're creating a danger for themselves, and yet they continue to do it. This is the Low Country Digital History Initiative website, provides this definition, and I'm just going to read it. In societies with slaves, slaveholders could treat enslaved people brutally precisely because they were marginal to their economic needs. So if your economic well-being does not depend on your slaves entirely, then you can brutalize them. You don't have to worry that they're going to wreck your life, your economy. In slave societies with large enslaved populations, the practice or threat of violence served to punish resistance, prevent rebellions, and maintain the master-slave power structure, because the economy is dependent on the enslaved workforce. In Barbados, if their enslaved Africans went away or all died, sugar production is going to come to a screeching halt. We'll see that will become the case in South Carolina with rice production. So with these problems, the fear of servant uprising and the servant of slave rebellion, South Carolinians, some of whom will become South Carolinians, passed some legislation in 1661, an act for the good governing of servants and ordaining the rights between masters and servants. So it's agreed, or they acknowledge that servants, white servants, Christian servants, have rights. But the other act passed is an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes. This is the infamous Barbados Slave Act. So what they are trying to do is improve conditions for white servants, and they're trying to really crack down on enslaved blacks because they present such a danger. And so this legislation is aimed at controlling both groups, but it will point out things like you can't be reckless in the way you punish a servant because they have rights. They have rights. You can't be totally reckless in the way you punish an enslaved African because you might cause a rebellion. So you have to stay within reason and also preserve your workers. So now I'm going to shift to England. Next pin's in England. You recognize these folks, maybe. This is Charles I. This little type down here is Maria, and the baby, the infant here would be Prince Charles. Okay, and this is back in 1632. Charles I is a contentious fellow. He does not get along with members of Parliament, particularly the Puritan faction in Parliament, and he will suspend Parliament. He'll raise taxes. He'll do a lot of things to anger people, including having 5 members of Parliament arrested. When he has to call them back into session because he needs money to fight a war, they immediately turn and use the opportunity that they're together to start passing legislation, and a war breaks out. This is the English Civil War, 1642. And as you undoubtedly know, this will not go well for the Royalists. In 1649, Charles will have his head cut off. And the leading general of the parliamentarians, Oliver Cromwell, will become the guy in charge in England. It's at this moment that Thomas Hobbes, who's a royalist, a supporter of the king, writes this book, Leviathan, expressing his fears. In the absence of an absolute sovereign, we're talking about absolute power. This is one of the problems that King Charles I had. He thought that the king only responds to God himself. Nobody else can stop the king. His power is practically unlimited. Parliament didn't agree. In the absence of an absolute sovereign, there would be no law. Competition for power and wealth would go unchecked. The condition of man would become a condition of war of everyone against everyone. So Thomas Hobbes sees just chaos, society devolving into every man out for himself. That's his great fear. Well, there is somebody with a fairly strong hand at the tiller in England, and Cromwell. He will actually use too much authority, a lot of Englishmen will think. His foreign policies will lead to commercial wars with the Dutch and with the Spanish. He will have the Western design pushing into the Caribbean, trying to basically take Spanish possessions. He will be responsible for the English seizure of Jamaica. He will also be in charge, if you will, when Parliament passes the Navigation Acts. And those are acts meant to control the English mercantile system and to control imports and exports, basically to get English colonies trading just with the mother country or with other English colonies. This will come up later, not later in this talk, but later in history. The Carolinians and other colonies will have to deal with these navigation acts. They'll be part of the reason that we end up in a revolution in the 1770s. So Cromwell will die of natural causes in 1658. And by then, a lot of influential Englishmen will have decided that what they need is a king again. Cromwell's son, they make an attempt at letting him rule, and that doesn't work out. So with the assistance and at the invitation of powerful men in England, Charles II returns from exile and becomes the King of England, Ireland, and Scotland in 1660, in what we know as the Restoration. These men who put him on the throne include parliamentarians and include royalists. So you've got a mix. There has to be some kind of agreement on restoring the monarchy. So the king owes people a debt of gratitude, especially these people who put him back on the throne. And this is where we bring the Lords Proprietors into the picture. Charles grants Carolina to the Lords Proprietors in 1663, grants them basically from Southern Virginia down to this line here. And then 1665, he'll extend that grant down here, down below St. Augustine. Here's Fort St. Augustine, you can see right there on that map. So he is clearly extending this grant well into territory that the Spanish claim. In fact, if you know the history of Florida, you know that the Spanish in 1565, I believe it was, wiped out a colony of French Huguenots who came and tried to settle in the area of St. Augustine. They need to protect those shipping lanes between Cuba and Florida for their treasure fleets, or at least they did at that time. So this grant goes into Spanish territory, and so it's inevitable that there's going to be trouble there. Sir John Colleton has been in Barbados. He's been a royalist. He supported King Charles I, gave him huge loans. So he will be appointed to a higher position. He'll be knighted by Charles II. He will serve on two influential bodies, probably more, but the two I want to single out. The first Council for Foreign Relations, Plantations rather, and the Royal African Company. So he's an influential guy. He's on these two influential bodies. Let me come back to this question. If we look at the other 7 Lords Proprietors, why them? I mean, there were, for example, the Council for Foreign Plantations had, do I have it on this? No, had many, I think something like 40 members. And there were a lot of people in the Royal African Company. How these exact people were selected to be given the Carolina grant, I can't answer that precisely, but I can point out some connections. Colleton was the Royal African Company member. Monk was his cousin. Berkeley was his cousin. This John Lord Berkeley was his cousin. George Carteret was also a Royal African Company member. Anthony Ashley Cooper was also a Royal African member. He also was a Barbadian slave owner, where Colleton was from. Lord Craven was also a Royal African Company member. So if we were trying to look at qualifications, the qualifiers to be included in the Lord Proprietors, for one thing, it'd be good to be related to Colleton, because the number of his cousins end up as grantees. The second thing would be to be involved in the Royal African Company. And I might mention that Colleton's on the first Council for Foreign Plantations. Ashley Cooper will be president of the Council of Trade and Foreign Plantations in 1672, 1674. So you see the interrelationships of these men. What I can't do is go through all of other English nobility and aristocracy and say, oh, nobody else could fit in this. But these are the 8 men who end up with that grant. Now, let me go back to the previous slide. If you ask, what do they intend to do? What do they want to gain from this? We can look at different things. In the book, I basically say they look at Carolina as opportunity writ large. It's a place where there were resources, where they could exploit the people, where there was opportunity. This was checks in the mail, or not quite in the mail, but this is the checks waiting to be written. Okay. If we want to look in a more generous terms, maybe they are interested in extending the English Empire, especially if they're on colonies and plantations, as a bulwark against Spanish and papal influence, right? Catholicism coming up from the south, just like the English in the north. We'll talk about the French and Catholicism and having to put a check on that. For their own incomes, wealth from precious metals, gold and silver, and profitable exports. But you could also argue they're looking for the king's treasury for that. Income from quit rents. We know that that's probably likely because the first colony, they go over with a quit rent system in place. Income from plantations on the Barbadian model. You could say that's what they envisioned, but they undoubtedly knew that sugar wasn't going to grow there. I mean, that's an assumption, but I think they were counting from the beginning on other cash crops. Also, could it be a refuge for English families or landless Barbadians or French and German Protestants? Well, we know that Georgia will be founded on that basis as a refuge for the poor. And we know that there are the French Huguenots trying to flee. We know that poor Protestants from Germany will be invited to come to Carolina, and poor English families will be among some of the early settlers. So that's possible that they're looking at it as a refuge. But this last one maybe is more sinister. Is Carolina ideally a market for the Royal African Trading Company? It's just founded in 1660. The grant is given in 1663. There are already two members, well, more than that, the members of the African Trading Company. Were there 1, 2, 3, 4 members of the trading company? Do you think maybe they're looking at a map saying, well, here's a likely place we could market some of these enslaved Africans? So that's just something to consider. So the first settlement, as you know, John Hyatt covered a lot of this in great detail, did a better job than I could ever want to do, or ever hope to do. The first settlement is up in Albemarle. It's up at the Cape Fear River, and that settlement is supposed to produce quit rents. It's a settlement that's comprised mainly of Barbadians. The folks from New England didn't want to come down. They made a decision to go back home. But the Barbadians stick it out. Walter Edgar argues that there may have been as many as 800 people in this colony. But they depend on the oversight and the continued interest and investment of the Lord's proprietors. They need supplies. They need good oversight. They need connections in London. The Lord's proprietors become very distracted. Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1664. Remember, this colony is founded in 1665. The Great Plague of London, the Great Fire of London, and then the one supply ship that makes it during this time is wrecked. So this colony, basically nobody's paying the attention that they thought that they would get. Events in England are their undoing. And so they pack up and they go home. Also, John Navin, their governor, packs up and goes home before they do. So this colony doesn't work out. So now you've got the Carolina Grant is still empty of colonists. Still got Native Americans, okay? But it's empty of colonists. And it sits for a brief time idle, if you will, with no more settlers going there. But there's something hanging over their heads, and that is, I'll credit Nick Bunker for pointing this out in one of his talks, the Treaty of Madrid. The war between England and Spain had ended based on this treaty, and it was about to go into force in 1670. And it's agreed the King of Great Britain shall have, hold, and keep all places, colonies, and places in the West Indies or in any part of America which the said King of Great Britain do at present hold and possess. Okay, the devil's in the details. What's hold and possess mean? If you claim land from Virginia all the way down to the middle of Florida, but that's just a claim on a map, and you don't have anybody there, do you own that land? Does Spain have better claim? Because, you know, Spain has maps and documents that say that they own land that covers all of Carolina and into Virginia. So whose claim is going to win out in this? This is a reason why the people who own Carolina, the 8 Lords proprietors, have a fire lit under their butt. They need something there in 1670 when this takes effect. And so I would argue that this is when Shaftesbury sets in motion, and he will recruit John Locke, his physician and secretary, to help draw up a plan. One problem with the first colony was the colonists were kind of steered into the colony and given the message, okay, I hope you do well. Don't forget to pay the quit rents, right? Send checks in the mail. Well, they had figured out that that doesn't work. That colony failed. So now they want to try another colony, only this time they're going to have a plan. They're going to keep an eye on it. They're going to structure this. And this structure should lay the groundwork for a self-sufficient land-based society. It's going to be an agricultural society, one that might pose a solution to England's economic, demographic, and religious problems. And so the plan, the grand design, is laid out in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. Shaftesbury is the driving force behind this. The Lords Proprietors endorse it, adopted in 1669. And as I'm sure most of you probably know, it creates a semi-feudal hierarchy. It does offer religious liberty, but it will never be ratified by the settlers. So in the sense that it offers religious liberty, we say, oh, this is kind of a pre-enlightenment, enlightenment doctrine. Okay, this is Shaftesbury with his enlightened philosophy, and John Locke, the guy with the argument of natural rights and life, liberty, property, and so forth. They feed into this, but they also create this strange hierarchy where they assign titles and they create this stratified society with one thing that I think is entirely unrealistic. The Lords Proprietors will have their share of lands. They hope to get rich from this. Then they will create an aristocracy who will hold 20% of the lands. Then freemen can own the other 60% of land. So far, so good. But elite men and elite women, tenants bound to the land who have no voice in government, no legal appeals. And then slaves. The plan does, the fundamental constitution does allow for and have a specific provision regarding slaves. So they're expecting slaves. But you tell me, elite men and elite women, we're talking about 1670. What men and women in England want to commit themselves to a situation in which they don't own the land and they're bound to the land and they have no political voice or rights and they can't go to court? You can be a servant and get out after your 7 years of service. If you have the money, you can come over as a freeman. Where do they think they're going to get elite men and elite women who apparently are going to be among a major part of the labor force in America, in Carolina? So this is fantasy. They're dooming their plan from the outset, I think. Now, I want to talk about land allotments. I mentioned to Catherine that this was something I think is vitally important. They're going to give the rich folk, the people at the top, a lot of land. But even the other people, the freemen, can come in and get a lot of land. How can they acquire so much land? They can bring slaves, as I mentioned. That's Article 110. They can bring in slaves, and being Christianized won't free the slaves. But here are the head rights. Free grants of land for you to pay your passage over. 150 acres for showing up. Oh, you brought your wife and 2 kids? 150 acres for each male servant or slave, and 100 acres for your wife, and 100 acres for each of your kids. So if you come over with a family of 4, you're going to get 450 acres for the family of 4, and then add 3 servants to that. That's going to be another 450 acres. You've got 900 acres stepping off the boat. The head rights will drop down a little later on, but there's still, you bring over a family member or a servant or import an enslaved African, you'll get at least 60 to 70 acres. And in the beginning, you'll get 100 acres, 150 acres at the first fleet. So people can get huge tracts of land. Just for comparison, this is my hometown. This is Watertown, Massachusetts, founded in 1630 by Puritans. This is the first wave of Puritans who come in, okay? The initial land distribution, if you're a freeman, you get 25 to 80 acres. If you're going to get 80 acres, you have to be one of the more important, the wealthier men in the colony. 25 to 80 acres. In the second land distribution years later, they gave a landless freeman 13 acres. So a rich man in Watertown, my hometown back in 1636, might have had 45 or 60 acres. A freeman in Carolina who wasn't particularly rich might have had 650 acres just because he had more kids than the guy next door. So land is easy to get. Land is plentiful in Carolina, but what do you do with land if you don't have enough people to work it? We'll come back to that. So the first settlement, as you know, Charlestown is not its present location. It's up on the Ashley, and this will be the site of the settlement for the first 10 years. In 1696, we'll see that Charleston has taken shape. And look at all the names here. These are land grants that these people have gotten in 1696 or by 1696. So the people have the land, but what are they going to do with it? The Goose Creek men from Barbados, they are not content to settle in Charleston. So as you know, they go out west and they will become the leading force in Carolina. They will control the deerskin trade. They'll control the Indian slave trade. They will have the money to buy the most land. The large proprietors will have such a problem with them. They will try to recruit other people to counter the influence of the Barbadians. And that's when these recruitment efforts go in and go on, and they start getting Frenchmen and Huguenots and people from Germany, poor Protestants and other Englishmen. This is what they're doing. The first 50 years, deerskins, naval stores, beef, pork, they're trading with Barbados, but enslaved Native Americans. This is the Native American slave trade, which will become immensely profitable for a small handful of men. And those, in particular, the Barbadians. So thanks to an alliance brokered by Woodward, Native Americans, the Westo, start delivering captives to Charleston that are then shipped to Barbados. And at the same time, we see enslaved Africans being bought from traders in Barbados. So picture a ship at a wharf in Charleston unloading Africans, enslaved Africans, and loading up with enslaved Native Americans for the return trip to Barbados. This is going to cause huge problems in the colony. A group of Scotsmen will try, of Scottish Covenanters will try to get in, horn in on the Indian slave trade in Stewartstown. If you don't know this book, I recommend it. Peter Moore's Carolina's Lost Colony, where he tells the story of Stewartstown and how in the short time span of 6 years, they will get invested in the trade. They'll raid Spanish Florida in search of slaves, and the Spaniards will come up and wipe that settlement out. Here's a quote in the book from a Native American, 1700. The greatest traffic between the English and the savages is the trade of slaves. Men take the women and children away and sell them to the English. So you've got this thriving slave trade. So you have to worry about enraged Native Americans. You're increasing the population of enslaved Africans. And at the same time, your neighbors to the south are the Spanish, who you every few years have interaction with, an unfriendly interaction. The Spanish will invade, the English will go on counteroffensives. In 1702, the governor leads a slave raid down to the St. Augustine area. So you've got trouble with the Spanish as well. So here's a quote from the Grimm here, from my book. Few men grew rich in South Carolina during the first 50 years of settlement. Men linked to the Indian and deerskin trades and then to the trade in Indians themselves had a clear leg up on the rest. When I did the interview with Walter Edgar, the thing he seemed most surprised about was I had located all these ads in the newspapers in Boston for Carolina Indians. They were shipping Native Americans not only to Barbados, but up to Massachusetts, where they were being used as slaves there. And look at the last entry here. ran away from their masters in Boston. Okay. One runaway was from Mr. Samuel Adams, Malta. This is Sam Adams' father. Sam Adams, the great revolutionary. We're drinking the beer, Sam Adams. This is his father, the malter, the brewmaker, owning Carolina Indians. Sam Adams grew up in a house that had at least one Carolina Indian in it. So Charleston has lots of reason. Charlestonians or Carolinians had lots of reason to be worried. Spanish of the South, Native Americans who obviously would have to eventually resent the Indian slave trade, a growing number of enslaved African Americans or Africans and then African Americans. So what we end up with is a walled city, a city with moats, with a drawbridge, with walls and built for defense. Look at some of the legislation that they pass in the assembly during this period. An act for the encouragement and destroying of beasts of prey. An act for the prevention of runaways deserting this government. An act for the settling and regulating the militia. An act for settling a watch. An act for the better ordering of slaves. An act for raising money for the public use in defense of this province. This is a colony that is in trouble. Here's the act for preventing runaways. Look at the second part. Colonists and Native Americans would be rewarded for the capture of fugitives, and they were empowered to beat, maim, or assault those who resisted. If you were in South Carolina and wanted to get out, you could only do so with the governor's permission. If you ran away, you might have Native Americans coming after you for a bounty to return you to South Carolina. There's also religious infighting. There's a pamphlet by Daniel Defoe all about that. And in 1708, when we look at the population, the census the governor took, white inhabitants, 4,000, enslaved native, 4,100, enslaved Native Americans, 1,400, enslaved Africans, 4,100. There are more enslaved people than free people in the colony. Thomas Nairn suggests that maybe they should build a plantation economy worked by African and Indian slaves on the ruins of Indian villages. This is the person in charge of the deerskin trade. So here's the question that's kind of at the center when I talked about land allotments. But a rational man will inquire, when I have land, what shall I do with it? What commodities shall I produce that will yield me money in other countries that I may be enabled to buy Negro slaves, without which a planter can never do any matter? So you need slaves if you want to do well. And that is, they're recommending, if you're going to come over, you need to stock your lands beginning with 20 Negroes. It hits the fan in 1715. The Yamasee War, the Native Americans rise up and practically drive the English into the sea. Ambitious merchants and planters imported thousands of Africans, regardless of the harm they wreaked on the captives and on their own colony. And other things that made this colony grim. My book is The Grim Years. Major hurricanes, and we're talking about hurricanes that overwashed the peninsula, that washed houses away with people on the roofs, that washed every ship in the harbor up onto the land or dashed it on the rocks. Major fires in Charleston. Every colonial city had fires. Charleston had their share, really devastating. Charleston epidemics. This became known as a place where people came to die because of the sickness. And you can see as the slave trade increases and more enslaved Africans are brought in, the number of yellow fever epidemics increase. And then problems with pirates who were useful in the beginning because you could trade with them and get hard coin, later become a problem. For example, when Blackbeard holds the town captive, demanding medical supplies. And then finally, if we look at the political situation, the colonists refused to ratify the fundamental constitutions. The proprietors appoint 19 different men to the position of governor in 50 years, 19 different men, and they have to divide the colony and give them separate governors in 1710 because the North Carolinians so resent what happens in the South Carolina Assembly. So I argue here the colony's first 50 years are called the era of proprietary rule, but those years actually mark the disintegration of proprietary rule. As you know, in the Revolution of 1619, they throw off proprietary rule and South Carolina will become a royal colony. And so main point of my book that I hope people understand is that these are self-inflicted wounds. Individuals who enrich themselves at the expense of everyone and everything they touched, as Hobbes had predicted. And just very quickly, 1720, the first 50 years were miserable. When people think of South Carolina, they think early South Carolina, they think of these years. Look at the increase in exports between 1722 and 1728 to 32. And it's just an upward slope. South Carolina rice exports, in the first 25 years, there was no rice crop. They hadn't discovered it yet. Yet they're giving people huge tracts of land, and people are saying, we need enslaved Africans. To do what? To do what? To produce turpentine, to tar and pitch. So the rice industry comes in beginning in 1695, and you can see how it explodes in the 1720s. And that's when we see the number of enslaved Africans really start to soar. You see it goes from 11,000 to 20,000 in 10 years and to almost 40,000 in 10 years. So this plantation system, commitment to enslaved labor, and the emergence of rice as a cash crop sets South Carolina on its course. And now we get to what people think about when they think of early South Carolina, right? But as I hope I've shown you or reminded you, South Carolina was not full of plantations, and everybody wasn't walking around with their pockets full of money in these early years. I think I had some other things I was going to discuss, but we're just over an hour. So, Catherine, I don't know if you want to open up for questions or how you'd like to proceed from here.
Yeah, let's I'm going to put some of our folks up and would just ask everybody if you haven't already put your name in the chat if you want certification credits. While you're doing that, let me just go through the list I have of guides who are on the call. I've got Adam Monacle, Braxton Williams, Jack Bowman, Lisa Harper, Mitchell Coates, Randy Johnson, Skip Evans. If there's anybody else who wants guide credits, let me know. And yes, I will definitely send out a recording link to anybody, specifically if you want a recording, just email me. But I think what I'll probably do is with the whole list, just send everybody a link to our Powder Magazine channel on YouTube, so that you can see the whole series of lectures, because they are really interconnected. And so I think, yeah, everybody definitely wants, I suspect a lot of people would really want to see your statistics again, Dr. Navin, because they're really fascinating as far as imports and exports and everything. One of the things that that's interesting to me when I was reading the book was thinking about the walled city fortification. You know, I think a lot about the fortifications of the walled city and how it all worked and influenced growth and everything, but thinking about the personal aspect of the walled city, especially during the Yamasee Wars, when you get so many refugees from outlying areas pouring into the walled city for protection. And it's the resultant overcrowding and starvation and the poverty and the density. Charleston wasn't envisioned to hold that many people. So you do get just disease and malnutrition and people on top of each other. And that's never good for living conditions, just deteriorate. So I think that's a really important aspect when we think about the walled city, not only protecting from, Spanish, but also from the Yamasee Wars and everything that was involved with that.
Well, Catherine, one thing I would add to that, you see people flooding in from the frontier because of that uprising and not wanting to return to the frontier. Two other things I'd mentioned. One is when the assembly saw the number of African Americans becoming problematic because they outnumbered the whites so much, they one solution they tried was, well, we'll just go get more whites to come into the colony. Not, oh, we'll stop importing Africans. It's, we'll just get more whites to balance that. And so they really start pushing this, the phrase poor Protestants, where they're bringing in the Palatines, people from what will be Germany, and they attract them to Carolina with the promise of free land, and then they double cross them. They arrive, a lot of them will arrive in the 1620s, and they will not be given the land they were promised, and they'll be sent up to the frontier, and a lot of them will get out to the frontier and say, no way do I want to live out here, and they will come back into Charleston. That contributes to Charleston's problems. And the other thing I'd mention is Governor Johnson's plan to defend Charleston with a satellite, a series of settlements on the frontier that will intercept those dangerous Indians or the Spanish. And that's where we see, even where I am in Conway, Kingston is one of those satellites. And so that string of settlements that are supposed to protect Charleston, that emerges from this attack you're talking about, from the wars with the Yamasee, that really introduced poverty large scale into within the walls of Charleston.
We had a question from Maria asking a little, can you expand a little bit about, I think a lot of us don't really quite have a clear picture of why the colonies split into North and South Carolina.
Well, North Carolina was basically settled by small tobacco planters filtering down from Virginia. And they did not have an adequate voice in the assembly in Charleston. And just think, back at the time we're talking about, for somebody, for North Carolina to be represented so as far south as Charleston, there weren't even roads, right? We're depending on water transport. So it's basically because they felt like the legislation that was passed was favorable. It was passed by people, the Goose Creek men gained control of the assembly in the 1790s. And so they weren't doing anything in the interest of North Carolinians. And that's why the first thing you get is a separate governor for the North. And then it became clear that the North should just be split off because you had two very different colonies taking shape. North Carolina does not get into plantation system and rice production, and they have their own needs. And hopefully that's a big answer. There's probably more detailed answers, but that's the one I can go with right now.
Well, I know we're a little after one, so if you have to peel off, no worries. I will say, and we can keep going with questions as long as people want to stick around. I will say that one of the reasons I wanted to do this series of talks this sort of August and September is we're hoping for, especially for you walled city fanatics and nerds like me, who are really interested in the walled city, we're hoping to do a walk the walls event in November. I'm hoping that we can do it November 7th. We're trying to get all the pieces pulled together, but mark your calendar, save the date for November 7th, and check our website for that. It's usually a really fun event to kind of get out and walk at least part of the outline of the walled city with different experts along the way. In the meantime, the Powder Magazine is going to be putting on a little bit different event in October. We're going to have an in-person event here at our very tiny little magazine that you see behind me on October 10th. We're going to jump into the 19th century and talk about Edgar Allan Poe in Charleston. We'll have Dr. Scott Peoples from the College of Charleston doing a talk. And Randy Johnson, who I think is on this call, is going to be a reader for us. He's going to do some Edgar Allan Poe readings of some of our favorites. So I think that'll be a fun event. You're the first to know about it here. We have a very limited amount of space, so we're capping it at 40 people. So if you're interested, that's already up on the website, so you can sign up for that if you're interested. But and I guess too, yeah, if anybody else has any questions, I will be sending this out. And as always, we always appreciate everybody who's so interested in the early colonial. And I think probably everybody's looking forward to getting recordings, John Navin, and we can put you in touch with Dr. Navin if you have additional questions, but I guess we'll probably just call it there and we'll see everybody soon. And thank you so much for attending these talks. I think they've been real. I've learned a terrific amount. So glad to see everybody, and I'll send those recordings out. And John Navin, thank you so much. Do
Thank you all.
come by the Powder Magazine
Thank
and you can get the book right there. It's a wonderful read, and there's so much in there. You'll be going back to it again and again. Wonderful presentation. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you soon. All right. Bye,
Thank you all.
guys.